When American soldiers from the 6th Armored Division entered Buchenwald concentration camp on April 11, 1945, they discovered something that military training had not prepared them to comprehend. Over 900 children, the youngest barely 4 years old, living in conditions that defied description. Their skeletal bodies bearing witness to years of systematic starvation, disease and brutality that the Nazi regime had designed to exterminate them. What stunned these American liberators was not simply the existence of children in a concentration camp, but the realization that these young prisoners had survived through an underground resistance network operated by adult inmates who had risked execution to hide, feed and protect children whom the SS guards wanted dead. The small group of American soldiers who took responsibility for these children in the chaotic days following liberation faced decisions for which no military manual provided guidance, improvising medical care, food distribution, and basic human comfort for traumatized survivors who had forgotten what kindness looked like, and in doing so participated in one of the most significant rescue operations of World War II that history would largely overlook for decades. The children discovered at Buchenwald on that April day represented only a fraction of the young people who had passed through the camp since its establishment in 1937, and their survival itself was a statistical anomaly in a system designed for their elimination. Nazi racial ideology classified children as useless labor, consuming resources without providing productive work, and standard SS policy dictated immediate execution of children too young or too weak to perform heavy labor. When transports arrived at concentration camps from across occupied Europe, SS doctors conducting selection on the railway platforms routinely sent children directly to gas chambers or shooting pits without even registering their names. The fact that hundreds of children remained alive in Buchenwald at liberation testified not to any Nazi mercy, but rather to the extraordinary efforts of political prisoners, primarily German communists and other political detainees who had been imprisoned for years and had developed covert systems within the camp to subvert SS orders. These resistance networks operated with knowledge that discovery meant immediate execution, yet prisoners continued hiding children, forging documents to list young teenagers as adults eligible for work details, and organizing secret food distributions that diverted scarce rations to the weakest and youngest inmates. The children hidden in Buchenwald came from across Nazi-occupied Europe, their journeys to the camp reflecting the systematic destruction of Jewish communities and the deportation of populations deemed undesirable by the regime. Many were Jewish children, whose parents had been murdered in other camps or ghettos, sent to Buchenwald because the systematic extermination facilities at camps like Auschwitz were overwhelmed, or because they had been captured in partisan areas where entire villages were liquidated. Others were Polish children seized during anti-partisan operations, Roma children from communities destroyed in the genocide that paralleled the Holocaust, and children of political prisoners who had been arrested with their parents. Documented testimony from survivors reveals that many children arrived without knowing their own names, having been separated from families at such young ages that they retained no memory of life before the camps. These forgotten children survived in a twilight existence within Buchenwald's brutal hierarchy, technically registered as prisoners, but without the work assignments that provided minimal protection to adult inmates, dependent entirely on the covert assistance of prisoners who remembered their own humanity despite years of dehumanization. Block 66 within. Buchenwald served as the primary location where child prisoners were concentrated, though children were also scattered through other blocks, where adult prisoners could more easily hide and protect them. The block system in concentration camps organized prisoners into wooden barracks that held hundreds of men in conditions designed for maximum suffering, with minimal sanitation, no heating, and deliberately insufficient space that forced prisoners to sleep in tiers of bunks, with multiple men sharing space designed for one. Block 66's barracks supervisor, a political prisoner who used his limited authority to shield children from the worst SS brutality, organized a system in which older teenagers were officially registered, while younger children were hidden during SS inspections or listed under false names with ages inflated to make them appear old enough for work details. This subterfuge required constant vigilance and the cooperation of hundreds of prisoners who understood that protecting children put their own lives at risk. SS guards who discovered the deception would execute not just the hidden child, but also any prisoner involved in the concealment. Yet the resistance network continued operating because abandoning children to certain death was a line that some prisoners refused to cross even when their own survival depended on absolute obedience to SS orders. The physical condition of the children when American forces arrived shocked soldiers who had already witnessed the horrors of combat across Europe. Private First Class Leon Bass, an African-American soldier assigned to civil affairs duties at Buchenwald, later described in oral history, interviews his first sight of the children's block, where dozens of boys emerged from the barracks so emaciated that their bones were clearly visible through translucent skin, their eyes appearing enormous in faces that had lost all traces of childhood. Bass noted that many children moved with difficulty, their legs so weakened by malnutrition that walking required enormous effort, and several collapsed simply from the exertion of coming outside. The youngest children showed signs of developmental delays caused by prolonged starvation, unable to speak or exhibiting behaviors that medical personnel would later identify as trauma responses. Captain Ralph Fink, a medical officer attached to the 6th Armored Division, examined children in the immediate aftermath of liberation and reported finding evidence of tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery, and other diseases that flourished in the camp's appalling sanitary conditions. Fink's medical reports documented that virtually every child suffered from severe malnutrition, with many exhibiting symptoms of vitamin deficiency diseases that had been eradicated in developed nations decades earlier. The initial American response to discovering the children reflected both compassion and confusion about how to address a humanitarian catastrophe that exceeded all expectations. Military government officers who entered Buchenwald had been briefed to expect a prison camp holding political prisoners and prisoners of war, with some awareness that conditions would be poor based on reports from other liberated camps. Nothing in their briefings had prepared them for the industrial-scale death they encountered, with thousands of unburied corpses, survivors dying at rates of hundreds per day, an infrastructure so devastated that providing basic necessities like clean water and food was nearly impossible. The children represented a particularly acute challenge because their physical condition made them more vulnerable than adult survivors. But military regulations provided no guidance on caring for juvenile concentration camp victims. Officers improvised solutions, establishing a makeshift pediatric ward in one of the camp buildings, organizing special food rations that would not overwhelm digestive systems damaged by prolonged starvation, and assigning soldiers with medical training to provide round-the-clock care for the most critically ill children. Sergeant Robert Persinger, a medic from Ohio, emerged as one of the American soldiers who took particular responsibility for the children's welfare in the days following liberation. Persinger's letters home to his family, preserved in the National Archives, describe his shock at the children's condition and his determination to help them recover despite limited medical supplies and the chaos of managing a camp that still held over 20,000 survivors requiring urgent care. Persinger wrote about a boy approximately 8 years old who had forgotten how to speak, communicating only through gestures and whose reaction to receiving food was to hide it under his clothing rather than eating, a learned behavior from years of food theft by stronger prisoners. Another boy, perhaps 10, followed Persinger constantly, terrified of being left alone, clinging to the American soldier as the first adult in years who had shown him kindness rather than cruelty. These individual relationships between American soldiers and child survivors repeated across the camp as liberators struggled to provide not just physical care but also the emotional support that traumatized children desperately needed. The question of what to do with the children beyond immediate medical care created complex problems that American military authorities had not anticipated. International law and military regulations addressed the treatment of prisoners of war and the administration of occupied territories, but provided no framework for managing hundreds of stateless children who had no homes to return to and no living family members to claim them. Many children's parents had been murdered in other camps or killed during the war, leaving the youngsters as orphans with no documentation of their origins or identities. The younger children could not even provide information about where they had lived before deportation, their memories either suppressed by trauma or simply absent because they had been too young when taken. American officers contacted international relief organizations and Jewish aid groups to coordinate long-term care. But in the immediate aftermath of liberation, the responsibility for keeping these children alive fell to American soldiers who were equipped and trained for combat, not childcare. The children's responses to liberation varied dramatically based on their ages, experiences, and psychological resilience. Some children, particularly older teenagers who retained clearer memories of life before the camps, expressed joy and relief when American soldiers arrived, understanding that liberation meant survival. These older boys, who had often served as protectors for younger children within the camp's resistance network, immediately sought to help American personnel identify the youngest and most vulnerable survivors who needed urgent medical attention. Younger children, especially those under age 7, often reacted with fear or confusion, unable to comprehend that the Americans represented safety rather than another threat. Several children tried to hide when American soldiers first entered their block, assuming that any adult authority meant danger based on their only experiences with adults in positions of power. Some children were so traumatized that they did not react at all, sitting silently and staring at nothing, their psychological damage as severe as their physical injuries. American personnel who worked with these children in the days after liberation often found themselves simply sitting with unresponsive youngsters, offering quiet presence as the only form of comfort they could provide until medical professionals could arrive. The improvised medical care that American soldiers provided to the children required balancing urgent needs against dangerous realities. Children who had been starving for months or years could not safely consume normal quantities of food without risking refeeding syndrome, a potentially fatal condition in which the body's metabolism is overwhelmed by sudden food intake after prolonged starvation. Medical officers established feeding protocols that started with small amounts of thin soup and gradually increased caloric intake over days and weeks, a process that frustrated soldiers who wanted to immediately provide hearty meals to obviously starving children. The temptation to overfeed was strong, particularly for American personnel who had grown up with abundance and who struggled to understand why giving hungry children more food could kill them. Several children died despite American efforts, their bodies too damaged by prolonged abuse to recover even with proper medical care. Each death devastated the American personnel who had worked to save that particular child, reinforcing the reality that liberation had come too late for many of Buchenwald's youngest victims. The organizational efforts to document and identify the children involved collaboration between American military personnel, international aid organizations, and surviving prisoners who had information about the hidden children's backgrounds. Prisoner-compiled records that had been secretly maintained despite SS orders listed many children under false names or with incorrect information, requiring patient detective work to establish actual identities. Some children who had been too young to speak when they arrived in the camp had to be identified through physical characteristics or tattoos that Nazi personnel had applied for administrative tracking. The Jewish relief organizations that arrived at Buchenwald within weeks of liberation brought personnel who could communicate in Yiddish and other languages that some children understood, facilitating identification efforts that would have been impossible for American soldiers, who typically spoke only English. These relief workers also provided cultural and religious context that helped American personnel understand the specific needs of Jewish children who had survived, including dietary requirements, religious practices, and the psychological importance of maintaining cultural identity after years in a system designed to erase it. The practical challenges of caring for hundreds of traumatized children in a former concentration camp included managing the location itself, which remained fundamentally unsuitable for child welfare despite the removal of SS personnel. The barracks where children had been held were disease-ridden structures that needed to be fumigated and cleaned, a process that required moving the children to temporary locations while their living quarters were made minimally habitable. American engineers brought in equipment to improve sanitation, install heating, and repair damage to buildings. But the fundamental infrastructure of Buchenwald had been designed for suffering, not healing, and transforming it into a place where children could begin recovering proved nearly impossible. Medical personnel advocated for evacuating all children from Buchenwald as quickly as possible, to hospitals or care facilities in areas untouched by the camp's contamination. But the massive logistical challenges of moving hundreds of severely ill children prevented rapid evacuation. The compromise solution involved establishing a transition facility within the camp that could provide better care than the original barracks, while preparations were made for more permanent placements. The emotional impact of the Buchenwald children on American liberators appears repeatedly in letters, diaries, and post-war testimonies from soldiers who participated in the liberation and subsequent care operations. These were men who had fought across Europe, witnessing combat deaths and civilian casualties, yet many identified the children of Buchenwald as the most disturbing aspect of the war they had experienced. Sergeant Leon Bass later became an educator who spent decades speaking about the Holocaust, explaining that seeing the children transformed his understanding of evil from an abstract concept to a concrete reality manifested in the deliberate torture of innocents. Bass described realizing that the Nazi regime had not merely killed children as collateral damage in military operations, but had systematically planned and implemented policies specifically designed to torture children to death, a level of moral corruption that exceeded anything he had previously considered possible. Other American soldiers who worked with the children at Buchenwald similarly reported that the experience fundamentally changed them, creating awareness of human evil that they carried for the rest of their lives. The children's gradual physical recovery in the weeks following liberation provided moments of hope amid the overwhelming tragedy. Medical records document children slowly gaining weight, recovering mobility, and beginning to respond to treatment for various diseases and conditions. The transformation from near-death to survival was gradual and incomplete, with many children suffering permanent physical damage from their years in the camp, but the trajectory moved toward life rather than death. American personnel celebrated small victories, a child eating a full meal for the first time, another taking steps without collapsing, a previously silent child speaking a few words. These incremental improvements represented profound triumphs over the Nazi system that had intended these children's deaths, and American soldiers who witnessed the recoveries found validation that their efforts had meaning even in the midst of incomprehensible horror. The long-term fate of the Buchenwald children involved dispersal to various destinations based on the complex realities of post-war Europe. Some children had surviving family members who could be located, and reunifications were arranged through the extensive tracing services that international organizations established to reconnect Holocaust survivors with relatives. These reunions were often bittersweet, with children meeting family members they did not remember, or discovering that only distant relatives had survived when parents and siblings had been murdered. Children without surviving family faced different futures, with many eventually emigrating to British Palestine, the United States, or other countries willing to accept orphaned Holocaust survivors. Several hundred children from Buchenwald and other camps were brought to a rehabilitation home in France, where they could recover in a supportive environment away from the sites of their trauma. These long-term placement efforts extended for months and years beyond the initial liberation, requiring sustained cooperation between military authorities, relief organizations, and governments willing to accept young refugees who had experienced horrors that most people could not imagine. The documentation and commemoration of the American role in rescuing Buchenwald's children has been uneven, with the liberation itself well remembered, but the specific stories of individual soldiers and their extended care efforts often lost in broader historical narratives. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, visited Buchenwald shortly after liberation and ordered extensive photographic and film documentation of conditions in the camp. Understanding that evidence would be needed to counter future claims that reports of Nazi atrocities were exaggerated, some of this documentation included images of children, photographs that became part of the historical record of the Holocaust, but that often circulated without identifying information about the American personnel who cared for these survivors. The individual soldiers like Robert Persinger, Leon Bass, Ralph Fink, and dozens of others who took responsibility for children's welfare operated in relative anonymity, their actions recorded primarily in personal letters and occasional military reports, rather than in official histories that focused on combat operations and strategic decisions. The children who survived Buchenwald and went on to build lives in the post-war world carried memories of American soldiers who represented their first experience of compassion after years of brutality. Post-war testimonies from survivors who were children at liberation frequently mention specific American personnel who showed them kindness, shared food, or simply provided human connection at a moment of desperate need. Israel Meir Lau, who was 8 years old when Americans liberated Buchenwald, later became chief rabbi of Israel and spoke publicly about an American soldier who lifted him into the air when he was too weak to stand. An act of care that Lau remembered for the rest of his life as the moment he began believing he might survive. These personal connections between individual children and individual American soldiers represent the human reality beneath the statistics of liberation, the countless small acts of compassion that accumulated into something larger than any single person's contribution. The broader significance of the American rescue of Buchenwald's children extends beyond the immediate saving of lives to encompass what their survival represented about the ultimate failure of the Nazi genocide. The Nazis had designed their concentration camp system to eliminate entire categories of people from existence, with particular emphasis on murdering children to ensure that no future generations would survive. The existence of even a few hundred surviving children represented a defeat of that genocidal intention, a testament to the resistance networks within the camps and to the intervention of Allied forces who arrived in time to prevent the complete annihilation that the SS had planned. American soldiers who participated in the liberation and rescue did not set out to defeat Nazi ideology. They simply responded as human beings to the immediate needs of suffering children. But their actions contributed to the preservation of lives that the Nazi regime had marked for extinction. The medical and logistical challenges that American personnel faced in caring for the children revealed broader inadequacies in how the Allied military had prepared for concentration camp liberations. Despite intelligence reports that documented Nazi persecution of Jewish populations and other targeted groups, military planners had not fully anticipated the scale of human devastation that liberating forces would encounter. The absence of specialized medical teams, child welfare specialists, and interpreters familiar with multiple European languages meant that American soldiers improvised responses to situations for which they had no training or resources. This unpreparedness had tragic consequences, as some survivors died from well-intentioned but medically inappropriate care, including cases of refeeding syndrome and disease transmission. The lessons learned at Buchenwald and other liberated camps would inform later military operations and humanitarian interventions, contributing to the development of protocols for managing mass atrocities. But for the Americans who liberated Buchenwald in April 1945, such protocols did not yet exist. The question of how American soldiers made sense of what they witnessed at Buchenwald, particularly regarding the children, appears in post-war psychological research on combat trauma and moral injury. Military psychiatrists who studied returning veterans found that many soldiers who participated in camp liberations experienced psychological distress that differed from combat-related trauma, involving guilt about not arriving sooner, anger at the Nazi perpetrators, and lasting distress from having witnessed extreme human suffering they were unable to fully alleviate. The children of Buchenwald featured prominently in these trauma narratives, with soldiers reporting nightmares about the youngsters they had tried to save and persistent questions about why such suffering had been allowed to occur. The moral dimensions of the rescue efforts extended beyond the immediate work of providing care to include deeper questions about human nature, evil, and responsibility that many soldiers struggled with for decades after the war ended. The role of military photographers and journalists in documenting the children at Buchenwald created a visual record that became central to Holocaust education and remembrance. Photographs of liberated children, particularly the well-known image of children behind barbed wire looking at American soldiers, circulated globally in newspapers and magazines, providing visual evidence of Nazi crimes that made abstract reports of atrocities concrete and undeniable. These images served important purposes in educating the public and supporting war crimes prosecutions, but they also raised ethical questions about photographing traumatized children without their consent or understanding of how their images would be used. American military personnel who took these photographs were generally following orders to document camp conditions for evidentiary purposes. But the humanitarian implications of photographing suffering children created moral tensions that some photographers recognized and struggled with at the time. The integration of child survivors into post-war societies involved challenges that extended far beyond physical recovery, requiring psychological support, education, and social services that varied dramatically in quality, depending on where children eventually settled. Some children who emigrated to Israel or the United States received comprehensive support through Jewish community organizations that understood their specific needs and experiences. Others placed in institutional care or with distant relatives received minimal support, their psychological trauma unaddressed in an era when understanding of childhood trauma was limited. The American soldiers who had cared for children in the immediate aftermath of liberation generally lost contact with them once the children were transferred to long-term placements, leaving soldiers without knowledge of whether their rescue efforts had lasting positive outcomes. This absence of closure troubled many veterans who wondered throughout their lives what had happened to the children they had tried to save. Looking back at the American rescue of children from Buchenwald provides insight into both the nobility and the limits of individual action in the face of systematic evil. The small group of American soldiers who took responsibility for these children performed acts of genuine heroism, working beyond their military duties to provide care, comfort, and hope to traumatized survivors. Their individual compassion made tangible differences in children's lives, providing the immediate care that enabled survival and beginning the long process of physical and psychological recovery. At the same time, the fact that American forces arrived to find hundreds of children in desperate conditions serves as a reminder that the rescue came late in the war, after the vast majority of Jewish and other targeted children had already been murdered. The children liberated at Buchenwald represented a tiny fraction of the approximately 1.5 million children killed in the Holocaust, survivors whose existence was almost accidental, rather than the result of deliberate Allied efforts to prevent the genocide. The American soldiers who rescued Buchenwald's children deserve recognition for their compassion and dedication. But the broader historical context reminds us that liberation was not salvation from the Holocaust, but rather an end to the suffering for the small number who had managed to survive until Allied armies arrived. The true rescue would have been preventing the camps from existing in the first place. Intervention that came too late for the million children who died before American soldiers reached Buchenwald on that April day in 1945.